would this exchange rate arrangement make it more difficult for CFA countries relative to non-CFA countries in Africa, and why?
Thank you so much for having me. I want to congratulate Ali for such an important and significant contribution to our understanding of the mechanisms and the structure, architecture of the CFA Franc Zone. And we cannot emphasize enough that it's still a myth, even after this conversation today, the myth is still going to be there because there's still a lot that is not known. I was born and raised in the Franc Zone. And I think of somebody in my home city of Mamfe in the Anglophone region of Cameroon who has acute kidney failure and doesn't have access to kidney transplant. The only maybe 3 options that are to them is recurrent dialysis, recurrent medication, and lifestyle changes. Now, if you see for these 3 options that are before them, they can't have 2. They can't have dialysis, they can't have medication. They would just have to stay on lifestyle changes like diet and or whatever. How is that really going to help this patient? This is exactly what we have. The CFA Franc Zone is as the author has clearly demonstrated in his book. We're taking away 2 important development tools from the hands of development policymakers. The exchange rate is not available for them. Monetary policy is not available to them. And even the one-lane policy that is left, fiscal policy, is still constrained. So the big question, to answer your question, is we still need to deconstruct the myth around the CFA Franc Zone, why it was even set up that way. And because we're still getting arguments that in support of the system, why it should continue. So I think an important contribution of Ali's book is to help us understand the myth and to deconstruct it. And I want to do that in 4 points. Number 1, the first myth is that the reason why these 14 Francophone African countries should stick to a colonial arrangement, monetary arrangement, and deny themselves these 2 indispensable development tools, monetary and exchange rate policies, is because they're going to benefit from unlimited convertibility of the CFA to the euro. That's a myth. As we see in practice, it seems like the unlimited convertibility of the CFA to the euro actually hurts CFA countries, actually reinforces the overvaluation of the currency. And there's research on that. Mamadou published a paper in 1997 that highlights, the kind of dynamics going on between Nigeria and Niger, the informal trade between the 2 countries, where the volume of trade between these 2 countries rises with the difficulty that Nigerians face in obtaining US dollar. And so whenever the CFA franc is overvalued, there's another self-reinforcing mechanism through the Naira CFA parallel exchange market, suggesting that the lack of competitiveness of these countries is also tied to the dynamics of the Naira CFA parallel exchange rate, in particular the ease with which or difficulty with which Nigerians have access to the dollar to import manufactured goods. That's one of the myths. The unlimited convertibility, so much acclaim of, we don't know what it means. It might actually be hurting countries. The second myth that we need to deconstruct is a myth that the reason why these 14 African countries should stick to this colonial arrangement, denying themselves 2 indispensable development policy tools, is because of the low inflation and short-term macroeconomic stability that is guaranteed by the PEC is good for them. But we have seen from the author's work that this cannot be true. This can be far from truth. The threshold by which, beyond which inflation would hurt these countries is around 10%. That's the threshold at which inflation can hurt these countries. And for the advanced countries like the United States, the threshold is above 3%. So why would anybody be targeting 2% inflation goal for 60, 70 years? And we know the short-term trade-offs of that ridiculously low inflation target is that you're going to get very high unemployment rate for the continent's youths who are in the millions trying to cross the Sahara and ending their lives prematurely. How would Sub-Saharan Africa create 20 million jobs each year with such would deny itself the development tools is a paradox. The text of the myths that we need to deconstruct, the author has done a good job on that, but we still need to sensitize the public is that the reason why these 14 African countries should stick to this arrangement, denying themselves the tools that they need for development, is because France is such an altruistic partner with sacrificing their all to help Africans. Whereas we know that Jacques Chirac, the former president of France, himself said in a speech on September 26 in 2009 that most of the banknotes that his compatriots have in their wallets come from exploitation of African continent for centuries. So how could it possibly be that France is not benefiting from this system, whereas the system is based, it has made the currency overvalued perpetually for 60 years, therefore making it cheaper for France to sell its product, and also the Francophone elites, easier for them to buy the ostentatious goods that they need from France. Finally, let me end on this, or I can go back into this conversation during that. I think we were aiming towards solutions, not the problems, but we need to understand and deconstruct the myths before we understand the solution. Finally, the fourth myth is that the reason why these 14 African countries should stick to this colonial arrangement and deny themselves two indispensable development tools is because the Francophone Africans are not smart enough to implement and manage their own independent currencies. I hear this and my heart bleeds to hear this kind of arguments, and sometimes propagated by Africans themselves, especially those who have had the privilege to serve at prestigious institutions. That tells me that Afro-pessimism remains one of the elephants in the room to Africa's emergence. So I'm ending by saying, yes, my message for the Afro-pessimists. I would like them to explain to me how Ghana successfully implemented its own currency, the cedi, and is currently running an independent central bank and targeting inflation very successfully. I want them also to explain to me how Mauritania, a former French colony, left the zone and implemented its own currency, the Wagua, in 1973. They might not be doing great, but they did something. I want them to also explain to me how Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, all former French colonies were able to implement and manage their own independent currencies. So the way forward, I'm going to come to your answer in the second part, but we needed to throw out these myths so that we can face the reality. And I believe in reality. I know there is an optimal solution, but there's also a solution that is more pragmatic and possible and feasible in the near term. But I'll talk about that in the second term if I have the chance. Thank you so much.
Julius, thank you very, very much for helping us, indeed, helping us demystify the myths, as you put it, the 4-point agenda for demystification, consistent with what our author Ali had also articulated brilliantly in his opening remarks. There was something you said, Julius, which makes me pivot right now to a question about the very fact that the West African countries, the conversation has been going on since Adam was a boy of a single currency in the region. And of course, most of the West African countries involved in the new, to be introduced ECHO, are also members of the CFA Franc Zone. I was just wondering, in the same vein of your point on demystifying the myths, how do you see this playing out? And after you, I would like Ali to also come in here and address this point.
Thank you, Aloysius. Thank you, Aloysius. That's a very pertinent point. And I would say we start from the macro. From the macro point of view, I think most economists agree that regionalism, regional cooperation in trade, economic, monetary, and fiscal policies is something that African countries should jealously seek, given the nature of their economies. So that's one thing they would have to keep. But how do they do that? How do you put, I'm talking about the West African currency now called monetary union, now called with this currency called ECO. How do you do that when you have a major oil importer? Ali mentioned that in his book, a major oil importer, exporter and oil importers in the same zone. So it's quite tricky. I don't know the answer, But what I could suggest, what I see as a part, and I actually agree with Ali on that, is that the Franc zone would need to continue in its subgroups. In other words, the CMAC as a group of its own, and the WIMO as a group on its own, and of course, how the WIMO integrates with the other Anglophone countries is another conversation. But I think a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. So we first of all have to disentangle these countries, decouple them from the euro completely, delink them from the euro. I don't agree with Ali that a peg to any whether a basket of currencies or this would be ideal. Right now, for me, I think that is a second best solution, because you're still going to tie the hands of policymakers around exchange rate and monetary policies that will not do these countries any good. So there is the ideal, and again, there is no solutions, it's just trade-offs. If you see where I'm going with this, there are no solutions, they're just trade-offs. What is the trade-off of pursuing a managed floating regime? The trade-off would be that these countries have a lot, or they have all their fiscal policy tools with them. They would be able to have competitive exports by fine-tuning the exchange rate, generate job expansion, reduce poverty, raise per capita income. They have the exchange rate tools to deal with shocks that come from all sorts, and balance of payments. And more importantly, Africans want a sense of national sovereignty. They need to have their own currency. So if managed float would be the first leg towards that dream, that aspiration that Africans are looking for. A peg regime would still not take them to a significant step. That's why I don't believe in the ECO, the thing that has been created in West Africa. We'll watch and see. I don't see it will go any further. What was there?
You, Julius, and thank you for laying out some of the myths as you described them in your last intervention. One of the things that Ali does very well in this book is a comparative analysis. Comparing CFA economies with economies on the African continent and outside the African continent. From your research and your knowledge of the literature and of Prof. Ali's book, what are some of the key lessons that CFA countries could learn from others as they think through the decision to delink or not to delink?
Thank you, Raymond. Yeah, so Ali rightly points out in his book that no country has successfully, developing country has successfully lifted up several people out of poverty without a vibrant and competitive agricultural sector. And the current setup of the CFA franc doesn't favor agriculture. It's a tax on agriculture. And so this cannot continue. And my heart bleeds when I keep hearing that we need to do a comparative analysis to see the benefits and the cost benefit of the franc zone. There is no benefit from that zone. Low inflation target, we all know that low inflation target below the threshold that should really hurt has high consequences, high unemployment. What do we want? Short-term macroeconomic stability and pushing millions of young Africans across the desert to end their lives because they can't find jobs in their country. They can't stay in the villages and plant plantains and cocoyams and coffee and cocoa. So an agricultural sector will need to be revamped, and you cannot do that with this currency. This currency has killed Africa for 6 decades. So I'm not in favor of any peg. I used to think like that 10 years ago, but my thinking of it has changed dramatically. So one, the lessons we learn from East Asia or from Latin America is that no country can can consistently lift its people from poverty without a competitive exchange rate, without an exchange rate that favors agriculture where these countries have a comparative advantage. So you see where my policy recommendation goes to. It cannot be a peg currency. I could accept it as a one step towards something, but not as a goal in itself. So number one, the second thing, I think John mentioned it, industrialization. Now, agriculture should be linked towards industries. We should be able to take the first step towards agro industries, transformation of products, of local products, and before sending them to the market. That is a path we have seen happen in all industrial revolutions. And Africa needs to also do its own industrial revolution. And I'm happy there is a goal ahead, African continental free trade area, because I believe in regionalism. There's no way out of it. You have tiny economies that some of them are landlocked, and all of these things, adverse climate change that is coming. Regionalism would be the way to go. Is it easy? I don't know. And I'm sure it's not. But is it something should be pursued? Yes. So to answer your questions, there are just two things we can learn from them. No country has successfully developed without maximizing on its comparative advantage, which happens in the case of African countries is the agricultural sector. No country has successfully developed and advanced and lifted its people from poverty without an industrial policy. This cannot be done with this CFA regime, the way it is currently built. It will need to be deconstructed. Let me touch on one final thing. I think I don't want to sound like an activist. I actually have given policy recommendation to policymakers, so I know the challenges that they face. There's a difference between what we aspire to and what can be done. I know the powerful dynamics, political economy dynamics that would make this just a utopia, as Ali pointed in his book. We know the urban elite, the bureaucratic civil servants in the system, who are the ones benefiting from the system, and they will not want the system to change. So there are powerful forces. Number one, the bureaucratic elite, civil servant elites, and elites in the parastatals in these countries, who are the main obstacles towards any change, added to the kleptocratic neo-colonial leaders, who of course know that they will have to play the bidding of France to stay in power. Plus, also, we should not forget the forces in Paris, in Brussels, and at the Bretton Woods institutions. All of these forces are stacked against the African masses. The African masses are the ones to benefit from a competitive exchange rate, but they have against them all these powerful forces. Do I believe that they can win that fight? No. But should they know that they can? It is in their interest to fight it? Yes. So Ali clearly points that out in his book, and I believe maybe if we live long enough, maybe another century, we might come to a point where the masses are sufficiently educated and we're able to kick out all the people and fight and win against the forces that are against them. I'll pause for now.
Julius, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julius. I think you raised a number of very interesting points. We'll now come to the Q&A, but before we do so, I'd like to push back on a few of the points. One being, I do agree about the importance of agriculture and industrialization. If you look across the African continent, CFA zone and non-CFA zone countries have suffered similarly when it comes to agriculture and industrialization. So, so I'll have some challenges with that. And secondly, in terms of economic governance, yes, there are global dimensions, but a lot of the failures, both in terms of the formulation and articulation and implementation of the policies, are domestic. I think we have to accept that. And one of the things that Ali is pointing out in his book is that the domestic governance, the thinking around and behind domestic governance, has to evolve to meet the current challenges. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, CFA, non-CFA. But let me turn it back to Lucius. Apologies. And maybe you can go to some of the questions from our audience.
Thank you very much, Raymond, for weighing in there. I mean, Julius, very impactful points. Let's switch to the audience, and then if we have more time, we'll come back with another round of questions. There is one question here from Dr. Hassan Tuloy, a retiree of the World Bank, my old boss, and he asks, is maintenance of an effective CFA even possible, without managing the snake and having credible compensation mechanisms? Ali, do you want to tackle this before we go over to others? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question, and one that I thought about a lot when I was writing the book. I think that the CFA can be reformed. As a senior French official once told me, we all know the system is broken. We just don't know how to change it. So the question is, I think there's a growing awareness of the limitations. There's a growing kind of, debate on it. And I believe we need to get a kind of an orderly discussion, because as Julius pointed out, Christina, John, right? I mean, there's a roadmap that we could all sit together and kind of devise, right? So I believe technically there are many solutions to the exchange rate and the monetary policy. We have so much experience on inflation targeting. We have so much experience from Asia. We could share that. The technical is easy part. It's that complex political dynamic. Who do you shift? There's very powerful interests, some of whom are not very visible. And what I think Julius said is a very interesting point that I agree with. Many of the decisions affecting the CFA are made in Paris or Brussels or Washington. And so I think by bringing awareness and trying to shape the political equilibrium and proposing a cogent solution, we can show a win-win for France, for these countries. So I am optimistic on the techniques. I have been navigating the politics when I wrote this book, and it's a maze that it's been difficult to find my way out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. Raymond, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ali. Great point. And this one is for the panel. And it's a question from Herman Cohen of Cohen and Woods, former U.S. ambassador and also former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And his question is short and sweet, and he says, does the CFA zone have a common tariff on imports? I think his question underlies some of the points that come up about tariff harmonization. And I'll pose it to the panel. Anyone? Does it have a common tariff on imports? And what are the implications? Not just looking back, what have the implications been, but what are the implications as the zone looks towards the future? Maybe I could start with Christina and then get a quick word from both John and Julius.
No, please, Julius, go for it.
All right. So again, Franc zone, people tend to forget that there are two subzones inside it. So there is the Franc zone is just on paper. We're actually talking about the CMAC or the YMO. Those are the zones that have structure, not the zone, not the Franc zone itself in the name. And so, yeah, the CMAC and the YMO, they do function as custom unions. And so they do have common external tariffs for the members that are inside that each of those subgroups. But I don't know that there is a common external tariff for the two groups put together. That's what I would say on that particular question.
John, do you have any thoughts? Should they have a common tariff?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'll go with Julius's answer because he's more familiar with the zone. But what I'd like to add, though, is that both the YMO and the CMAC, they are not actually optimal currency areas, and so it's not really ideal in that sense. And the goal should really be to integrate into the African continental free trade area, which eventually it hopes that it will become a monetary union. So as it stands, I don't think it's really ideal in that sense.
Thank you so much, John. Ali, do you have any quick thoughts?
Yes, thank you. They both have a common external tariff. They modeled themselves a lot on the European Union, and they began with the common currency, and then they moved in the 1990s to a common external tariff. But there's 2 points I wanted to say here, right? Which is one of the problems in the Franc zone, and I probably didn't cover it enough in my book, it's a very oligopolistic part of the world. So when you look at transport, you look at finance, you look at utilities, it's a few dominant players, and the market is not open for a lot of new entrants. So what happens is you have, when I calculated the cost of exporting, the port cost, the transport cost, just you have $4,000 to export from Cote d'Ivoire to Long Beach, while in Bangladesh or in Dhaka and Shanghai, it's $2,000. So these oligopolies are causing the problem. And the second thing is, besides the fact that they don't trade with each other, you have a lot of non-tariff barriers. So just, you travel around the Franc zone and you have all these arbitrary checkpoints. So it's not a smooth functioning zone in terms of administration. It's very cumbersome and difficult, dirigiste almost. So, and the one last point. The last point I wanted to make is, I agree with also something Julius said about some of the policies. The trade liberalization agenda was, in my judgment, pushed prematurely on some of these countries before they had the industrial capacity. And I bring the example when I looked at data in China on the tariffs. China liberalized tariffs only in the 1990s. In the 1980s, China built a lot of industrial capacity. And in the 1990s, they liberalized. And so just my final point is, there's good industrial policy, and I've written a book on China. There's also bad industrial policy, but we can have that debate. Thank you.
All right. We have heard and talked about a number of challenges facing not just Africa and the zones we're discussing, but globally. But on the continent itself, in addition to the food, fuel, financial crisis, the debt crisis, the environmental crisis and climate change, etc., across the Sahel, the old certainties of fragility remain. And when you think of the fastest rising budget line item in many of these countries, it is expenditure on security and military spending. It's not something we read about frequently, but if you check any of the budgets of these countries, these line items are just rising astronomically. Clearly, there are opportunity costs here in terms of human capital and infrastructure spending, which we desperately need in these countries. Any thoughts from the panelists, beginning with you, Julius, on, you've been an advisor to many policymakers.
Yep.
Any thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you so much. Again, Lucius, that's a very brilliant point. And when I was making the recommendation of a managed shift, a managed float as the ideal exchange rate framework going forward, I was not without understanding that the potential risk in terms of how these countries manage debt, their debt, a point which Christina actually also raised. But you're bringing in another angle there. You know, how do these countries, especially those in the Sahel, deal with you know, exacerbating climate change or terrorism and all these other things? I think that the CFA zone, keeping the CFA franc actually limits these countries' abilities to fight terrorism, to deal with security challenges. The CFA franc is actually an inhibitor or a constraint to these countries in how they deal with the multiple challenges of climate change and security and terrorism. Why? Because every country needs to give itself some window, some policy space. We saw during the COVID-19 how nations, including the United States, were pump in a lot of stimulus to kind of resuscitate their economies. So why would a country that is facing this kind of enormous challenges, extraordinary challenges from developmental standpoint, from security to climate change, why would such a country tie its hands on two fundamental development policies that every country is using? Even the United States is using stimulus. So I think, and to your point, there's even an urgency for these countries to do something about switching away from this fixed currency regime and give themselves the macroeconomic policy tools that they need to deal with climate variability, to deal with security challenges, and to deal with youth unemployment and urban bias, rural sector bias, and the continuous exodus of young people, capital flight, something I think is associated with your point. Look at me teaching in a university in Southern California. I think I should be more valuable teaching in Cameroonian universities back home there. How is this country ever going to make it when capital flight, the odds are stacked against us, and an exchange regime change it cannot be delayed any further, I believe.
Earlier,